What happens when a late-night host decides to go completely off-script and challenge one of the most controversial royals of our time? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Seth Meyers for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to have it spiral into one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Harry walked onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted the verbal warfare that was about to erupt between these two men, culminating in a dramatic exit that left the entire studio audience in stunned silence. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when a simple interview turns into a battle of wills that exposes the raw truth about fame, family, and the price of speaking out. The Late Night with Seth Meyers' studio felt different that evening. There was an electricity in the air that even the seasoned crew members couldn't shake. Prince Harry had arrived for what his publicist had carefully orchestrated as a softball interview to promote his latest charitable initiative. But Seth Meyers had other plans brewing behind his trademark grin, as the show's theme music faded, and the audience settled into their seats. Seth delivered his opening monologue with his usual wit, but those who knew him well could detect something sharper in his tone. The jokes seemed more pointed, the political commentary more biting, and when he mentioned that Prince Harry would be joining him later, there was a glint in his eye that suggested this wouldn't be the typical celebrity puff piece. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have Prince Harry here tonight," Seth announced to the crowd, his voice carrying just enough emphasis on the word prince to make it sound almost mocking. "And I'm sure we'll have a perfectly normal, completely uncontroversial conversation about his wonderful life and all the great things he's doing." The audience laughed, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested they sensed something was coming. When the commercial break ended and Harry made his entrance, the applause was polite but not overwhelming. He looked every bit the polished royal he'd been trained to be, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and that practiced smile that had been photographed a million times. But as he settled into the guest chair across from Seth, there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever energy was radiating from his host. "Prince Harry, thanks for being here," Seth began, his tone friendly enough on the surface, but with an undertone that immediately put Harry on edge. "I have to say, it's fascinating to have someone here who's lived such a unique life. Born into ultimate privilege, had everything handed to you, and then decided to lecture the rest of us about how hard things are." Harry's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Well, Seth, I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. My life has had its challenges, just like anyone else's. Just like anyone else's." Seth leaned forward, his expression shifting from friendly host to something more predatory. "Really? Because I'm pretty sure most people don't get to live in palaces, have their education paid for by taxpayers, and then get to complain about how tough their family is while making millions from Netflix deals." The audience was beginning to sense that this wasn't going according to the usual script. Harry shifted in his seat, his media training kicking in as he tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Look, Seth, I came here to talk about the important work we're doing with mental health awareness and supporting veterans. That's what really matters." But Seth wasn't having it. "Oh, the important work. Right. Tell me, Harry, how exactly does sitting in a California mansion and giving interviews about how terrible your family is help veterans? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've turned your personal family drama into a career." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harry's jaw tightened, and for the first time since sitting down, his carefully constructed public persona began to crack. "I think you're mischaracterizing what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to shed light on important issues, to use my platform for good." "Your platform?" Seth's voice rose slightly, and the audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "You mean the platform you inherited by accident of birth? The platform that was built on centuries of colonialism and exploitation? That platform?" Harry's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Seth, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but what I'm trying to accomplish," Seth interrupted, his voice now carrying real heat, "is to understand how someone who's lived such an incredibly privileged life can sit here and act like they're some kind of victim. You had everything, Harry. Everything. A loving grandmother who was the Queen of England. A father who, despite his flaws, clearly cared about you. A brother who stood by you through everything. And you threw it all away for what? Hollywood fame? Netflix money? The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what it was like growing up in that environment, dealing with that level of scrutiny, that level of, oh, scrutiny. Seth's laugh was harsh and mocking. You want to talk about scrutiny? Let's talk about how you and your wife spent years complaining about media attention while literally courting it at every turn. You want privacy? You could have had privacy. You could have quietly stepped back, done your charitable work, lived your life. Instead, you chose the Oprah interview, the Netflix series, the book deals, the podcast tours. You chose to air your family's dirty laundry for profit. The studio audience was now completely captivated by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a public evisceration. Harry's composure was crumbling in real time, and everyone could see it. You think this is easy? Harry's voice cracked slightly. You think any of this has been easy? Losing my mother, watching my family turn their backs on my wife, being forced to choose between, forced? Seth's voice was incredulous. Nobody forced you to do anything, Harry. You made choices. You chose to marry someone who apparently couldn't handle the responsibilities that came with being part of the royal family. You chose to believe every piece of gossip and every perceived slight. You chose to burn bridges instead of building them. The mention of Meghan seemed to be the final straw for Harry. His entire body tensed, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerous and low. Don't you dare bring my wife into this. But Seth was relentless now, sensing he had found the nerve. That would expose everything. Your wife? The woman who spent less than 2 years as a working royal before deciding it was too hard? The woman who convinced you to abandon your family, your country, your duty? Let's be honest about what really happened here, Harry. You didn't leave because of media scrutiny or family drama. You left because you couldn't handle the fact that being royal actually requires sacrifice, requires putting duty before personal desires. Harry was on his feet now, his face a mask of fury, but Seth wasn't finished. The host stood as well, and the two men faced each other across the small table that separated them, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Sit down, Harry, Seth said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. We're just getting started. Harry remained standing, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled rage. The studio lights seemed to intensify the flush in his face, and every camera in the room was capturing the moment when a prince's composure finally shattered. I don't have to sit here and listen to this, he said through gritted teeth. Actually, you do, Seth replied, his voice carrying a cold authority that surprised even himself. You signed a contract. You came here to promote your charity work, remember? So let's talk about charity. Let's talk about how much money you've actually raised for these causes versus how much you've made talking about your personal trauma. The audience was completely silent now, the kind of silence that only comes when people are witnessing something they know they shouldn't be seeing. Harry slowly sank back into his chair, but his body language screamed defiance. You're completely out of line. Am I? Seth settled back into his own chair, but his posture remained aggressive, leaning forward like a prosecutor closing in on a guilty defendant. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've built an entire brand around being damaged goods. Poor little rich boy who lost his mommy and couldn't handle being second in line to the throne. Harry's hands clenched into fists on the armrests. Don't you dare talk about my mother. Why not? You've talked about her in every interview you've given for the past 5 years. You've monetized her death, Harry. You've turned Diana into a marketing tool for your victim narrative. Seth's voice was relentless now, each word calculated to inflict maximum damage. Tell me, what do you think she would say about you using her memory to justify abandoning everything she believed in? She would understand. Harry's voice was shaking now, with rage or grief or both. She would understand what it's like to be trapped in that system, to have your every move scrutinized, to be married to someone who doesn't love you. There it is. Seth interrupted, pointing across the table. There's the real issue, isn't it? This isn't about media scrutiny or royal duty or any of the noble causes you pretend to champion. This is about daddy issues. This is about watching your parents' marriage fall apart and deciding that the entire institution was to blame instead of just accepting that sometimes people aren't compatible. Harry shot to his feet again, this time moving toward the edge of the interview area. You don't know what you're talking about. You didn't live through it. You didn't watch your mother cry herself to sleep. You didn't see what that family did to her. No, I didn't, Seth acknowledged, standing again to match Harry's energy. But I also didn't inherit millions of dollars, a title, and a platform that could have been used to actually change things from the inside. Instead of working within the system to reform it, you ran away. And worse, you convinced your wife to run away with you. Leave Megan out of this, Harry warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Why? She's not some innocent bystander. Here, Harry. She knew what she was signing up for when she married you. She knew the expectations, the protocols, the responsibilities. But the moment it got difficult, the moment she realized that being a royal meant serving others instead of being served, she was done. And she took you with her. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Harry's face went through a series of expressions: rage, hurt, recognition, and finally something that looked almost like shame. She was treated terribly. The media, the family, they made her life impossible. Did they? Seth's tone was skeptical. Or did she make her own life impossible by refusing to adapt, by expecting special treatment, by demanding that centuries of tradition be changed to accommodate her preferences? Because from what I can see, every other person who's married into that family has managed to find their place and make it work. You're talking about things you don't understand, Harry said, but his voice lacked conviction now. The fight was starting to go out of him, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion. Then explain it to me, Seth pressed. Explain how. Someone who claims to care about mental health awareness, about supporting veterans, about making the world a better place, could justify abandoning the most powerful platform for doing exactly that work. Explain how running away to California and signing entertainment deals helps a single veteran or raises awareness for a single cause. Harry opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, he looked lost, like a man who had been so focused on running from something that he'd forgotten what he was running toward. Seth sensed the vulnerability and pressed his advantage. You want to know what I think happened? I think you met someone who told you everything you wanted to hear about how unfair your life was, how you deserved better, how you were too good for all of it. And instead of seeing that for what it was, someone who didn't understand the weight of duty and service, you chose to believe it because it was easier than doing the hard work. The hard work. Harry's voice cracked. You think it wasn't hard work? You think smiling and waving and cutting ribbons while your family whispers about you behind closed doors is meaningful work. I think it's more meaningful than sitting in television studios talking about how hard it all was, Seth shot back. I think showing up, day after day, year after year, putting the needs of your country and your people ahead of your own feelings is exactly what meaningful work looks like. But you wouldn't know, would you? Because you quit. The word quit seemed to hit Harry like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since the interview began, he looked truly defeated. I didn't quit. I was pushed out. By who? By a family that welcomed your wife with open arms. By a grandmother who bent over backward to accommodate both of you. By a brother who defended you through every scandal and mistake. Seth's voice was building to a crescendo now. Or were you pushed out by your own inability to accept that sometimes life requires sacrifice? That sometimes doing the right thing means putting other people's needs ahead of your own desires? Harry was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were blazing with renewed anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. You sit here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about other people's lives, and you think that gives you the right to judge me? To judge my wife? To judge choices you could never understand? Maybe not, Seth conceded, but I can judge the results. And the results are pretty clear, aren't they? You've made millions complaining about your problems while the monarchy you abandoned continues to serve, continues to do the work you walked away from. Your brother is still there, still showing up, still doing his duty. Your father is still there, despite everything you've said about him publicly. But where are you, Harry? What are you actually doing besides talking? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry's face cycled through a range of emotions before settling on something cold and hard. I'm done with this, he said quietly. Of course you are, Seth replied, his voice dripping with disdain. Because that's what you do when things get uncomfortable, isn't it? You walk away. You run. Just like you ran from your family. Just like you ran from your responsibilities. Just like, but Harry was already moving, yanking off his lapel microphone and throwing it down on the small table between them. The sound echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. That's it, Harry declared, his voice carrying across the stunned studio. I'm not doing this anymore. I don't have to sit here and be attacked by someone who thinks he knows my life better than I do. Seth stood up as well, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the confrontation. Running away again, Harry? How predictable. How absolutely predictable. His voice carried clearly without the microphone, years of stage experience allowing him to project his words to every corner of the studio. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The moment someone challenges you, the moment someone refuses to treat you like a victim, you bolt. Harry turned back toward Seth, his eyes blazing. You want to know why I'm leaving? Because you're exactly like them. You're exactly like the people I grew up with who think they can say whatever they want because of who they are, because of their position. You think your platform gives you the right to tear people down for entertainment. My platform. Seth's laugh was bitter and loud. I earned my platform, Harry. I worked for years doing stand-up in dingy clubs, writing jokes that nobody wanted to hear, getting rejected by every network in television. I didn't inherit my success. I didn't get handed a golden microphone because of my bloodline. The studio audience was completely captivated, some of them holding their phones, clearly recording what would become one of the most viral moments in late-night television history. The camera operators, initially confused about whether to keep rolling, had made the decision to capture every second of the unfolding drama. Harry took a step closer to Seth's desk, his hands shaking with rage. You think you're better than me because you had to work for what you have? You think that gives you moral authority? Let me tell you something about work, Seth. Try losing your mother when you're 12 years old and then having to walk behind her coffin while millions of people watch and take pictures. Try living every day of your life knowing that your pain, your grief, your mistakes are going to be front-page news. And yet here you are, Seth shot back without missing a beat, turning that pain into profit. You've made more money talking about your mother's death than most people make in a lifetime. You've turned your trauma into a brand, Harry. Diana, the perfect excuse for every bad decision you've ever made. The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again. How dare you? He whispered, but his voice carried through the microphone still recording from Seth's end. How dare you use her memory like that? I'm not using her memory, Seth replied, his voice steady and unforgiving. You are. Every interview, every documentary, every tell-all book, it all comes back to how she died, how it affected you, how it justifies everything you've done since. But here's what you don't want to admit, Harry. Diana would be ashamed of what you've become. The studio gasped collectively. It was the kind of statement that crossed every line of decency, the kind of personal attack that normally would have resulted in immediate commercial breaks and frantic damage control. But Seth wasn't stopping, and Harry wasn't leaving. She would be ashamed, Seth continued, his voice growing stronger, because she dedicated her life to service. She used her position to help people who had no voice, no platform, no power. She fought for landmine victims, for AIDS patients, for homeless people. She used her fame to shine light on people who lived in darkness. And what do? You use your platform to complain about how hard your life is. You use your voice to settle scores with your family. You've turned the Windsor name into a tabloid soap opera. Harry's composure finally shattered completely. You don't know anything about my mother, he screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. You didn't know her. You didn't love her. You have no right to speak for her. Neither do you. Seth screamed back, abandoning all pretense of professional composure. Neither do you, Harry. Because if you really loved her, if you really understood what she stood for, you would have stayed. You would have used your position to continue her work instead of running away the moment things got difficult. The two men were now facing each other across the narrow space between the interview area and Seth's desk, both breathing heavily, both red-faced with anger. The studio audience was completely silent, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to miss a single word of what they were witnessing. You want to know what your mother would think? Seth's voice dropped to a harsh whisper that somehow carried More weight than his shouting. She would think you're weak. She would think you're selfish. She would think you married someone who convinced you to abandon everything she died trying to protect. Harry's hands were shaking now, not with rage, but with something deeper, hurt, recognition, a terrible dawning understanding that maybe, just maybe, some of what Seth was saying was true. Stop, he said quietly. She would think, Seth continued, relentlessly, that you let Megan convince you to throw away the greatest opportunity for service in the modern world because your feelings got hurt. She would think you chose Hollywood over helping people. She would think you chose money over making a difference. Stop. Harry's voice broke completely. And you know what else she would think? Seth's voice was quieter now, but no less devastating. She would think your marriage is over. Because deep down, in a place you don't want to admit exists, you know I'm right. You know you made the wrong choice. You know you abandoned everything meaningful for someone who saw you as a ticket to fame rather than a partner in service. And that knowledge is eating you alive, isn't it, Harry? That's why you're here, desperately trying to justify decisions you know were wrong. That's why you spend every interview talking about how terrible your family is, because if they're the villains, then you can't be the one who made the mistake. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Harry stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of rage, hurt, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. For a moment, it seemed like he might collapse, might break down completely in front of the cameras and the audience and the millions of people who would eventually see this footage. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Seth's eyes. My marriage isn't over, he said quietly, but there was something hollow in his voice, something that suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced. And you're wrong about everything else too. Am I? Seth asked, his voice now calm, almost gentle. Then why are you here, Harry? Why are you standing in this studio, in front of all these people, looking like a man who's lost everything he ever cared about? Why do you look like someone who's finally realized that running away doesn't solve anything? Harry stared at him for a long moment, and in that silence, something shifted. The anger drained out of his face, replaced by exhaustion and something that might have been defeat. Because, he said finally, his voice barely audible, I don't know how to go back. It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, and it hung in the air like a confession. For a moment, Seth's expression softened, as if he too was surprised by the sudden vulnerability, but the moment passed quickly. Harry's face hardened again, and he turned toward the studio exit. I'm done, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm done with this show, I'm done with this interview, and I'm done with people like you who think they can judge my life from the outside. He strode toward the exit, his security detail scrambling to keep up. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Prince Harry, sixth in line to the British throne, stormed off a late-night talk show in front of millions of viewers. Just before he reached the door, he turned back one last time. You'll regret this, Seth, he called out, his voice carrying a threat that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Seth, still standing behind his desk, straightened his tie and looked directly into the camera. No, Harry, he said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the studio. I don't think I will. And with that, Prince Harry disappeared through the studio doors, leaving behind a stunned audience, a viral moment that would dominate social media for weeks, and the unmistakable impression that something fundamental had been exposed, not just about Harry, but about the cost of choosing fame over duty, celebrity over service, and personal grievance over public good. The cameras kept rolling as Seth turned back to his desk, picked up his notes, and looked directly into the lens. We'll be right back, he said, as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented, the complete and total dismantling of a prince's carefully constructed public image, broadcast live for the world to see.